the IAF, which stands for International Association of Facilitators. Since 2018, I've started a book series on architecting collaboration, and my latest book, in co-authorship with other renowned digital facilitators and guest co-authors, is titled Beyond Virtual Meetings. It's all about the importance of the digital tools that can extend and augment the power of you as a facilitator and a meeting host in a virtual online meeting, but also on the hybrid meetings that are going to be so much needed in this post-pandemic era.
Along with my co-author Martin Duffy and esteemed PhD colleague, we host Talk to Your Meeting Daughter, a series of hosted conversations with meeting experts that can advise you about how to transition to this new normal and take advantage of this incredible once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make the organization of your meetings more sustainable. Please stand by as the next show will start momentarily.
I think there's 3 pairs of the episodes where we link up one episode into the next. So that's one recurring feature. But the second recurring feature is that across multiple episodes over the 12 or over the 11, there are a number of fundamental themes that do come through that keep recurring. If you wanted to summarize them, you would say preparation, execution of the meeting, and post-meeting analysis. So those 3 ideas keep on coming up. In the preparation, the fundamental idea or question that consistently comes up is be absolutely clear on why are we meeting? What's our purpose? If we haven't got that, we shouldn't meet. That's a recurring thing. In terms of the execution, there's no consistent thing, but I think in relation to AI, the potential power of AI rests in answering 2 questions before we start using it. First question is, what can AI do that we as human participants cannot do? And the second question is, what can we as humans do and bring to meetings that AI cannot do? And if we address both of those questions as part of our meeting planning, and particularly using AI as part of our meeting planning, we are more likely to have much more successful meetings and much better use of AI overall. Now, they're just highlights that so I've got 6 pages of notes that I've written, but when you distill all of that stuff down into, well, what are the really simple fundamental takeaways that you might get from effectively 12 hours of conversation about meetings, they're the fundamental takeaways that I'm getting at this point. And there's 2 episodes that I haven't yet reviewed. The last 2, I didn't get to review the last 2, which is effective meeting inclusion and the heart of meeting design.
That's amazing. And Martin, I'm curious. So after this full year of monthly episodes, what is it that your perception about the future of meetings has changed?
I think it was picked up in 2 of our episodes, and a key question is the impact. Well, there's probably two key questions, Paul, actually. One is, now that we are past the pandemic and we are past the reactive response to the pandemic, in other words, we made a major shift to virtual meetings without planning it and without analyzing as we were going what the impact of that would be. So that's a fundamental issue that I think will impact the future of meetings. The second one is the impact of AI. The analytic and reportive capability of AI, I think, can and will have a really fundamental impact onto meetings. So those two elements combined, I think, will have the single greatest impact on our thinking about future meetings. And I think when we've studied and paid attention to the impact of the pandemic and the shift to virtual meetings, and then when we do more analysis of understanding that question that we talked about just a moment ago, what can people do that AI cannot do? And what can AI do that people cannot do? Then we will make the optimum use of AI, and we will use meetings in the optimum way, virtually, face-to-face, combined, and so on. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a road to travel to analyze massive developments in a very short time frame that have impacted pretty much everybody universally across the world, which is really significant.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing, and I particularly love the question you've posed on what can we humans do that AI can't, and this is an incredible question, and I would connect that with a recurring topic in our conversations, organizational culture, right? Because Absolutely. That's something that if humans can do that AI can do, is create an organizational culture, right? And how do you see organizational cultures evolving, Martin, in this post-pandemic era?
Yeah, that was a recurring theme across maybe 3 of our episodes, Paul. That was really interesting. That idea of culture and what culture means. And actually, one of our episodes, we actually talked about organizations having 3 different levels. So we have executive type level, we have management team or group management level, which is your line managers. And then we have teams, organic teams going about their group activities. And a key takeaway from one of our episodes was that the organization culture evolves from the interplay of those 3 levels in a cascade downwards. So how executive interacts with managers and how managers interact with teams. But significantly, there's an upward cycle of those interactions, how teams react or respond to managers and how managers react or respond to executive leaders. And that cyclical upwards and downward interchange is formative of the organization culture, because culture shifts. It's slow, but it shifts, and it shifts under those upward and downward cycles. And the key point was meetings are the fundamental crossroads at which those interchanges and exchanges take place. And one of our episodes, we spoke about how meetings are windows to the cultural soul of the organization. And that concept puts meetings front and center in importance of the development of the organization, because they fundamentally inform the culture that's going to evolve, because they are the place where this upward and downward cascade of interactions take place. Another point that came out of one of our episodes was this idea of the organization being a river of discourse, being a flow of conversation, ongoing, perpetual, and that meetings are analogous to islands in the middle of that conversational flow. So their meetings are a little bit like, you know, an oasis in the desert. They're like an island in a stream. They're a place where people come together to take stock, to learn from each other, to exchange with each other, to share with each other. And then we go back into the organizational flow again. But that point of respite, that point of pause that meetings provide is so fundamentally important to what organizations become. And again, it's a recurring theme that the importance of meetings in the organization may just be missed a little bit, because we naturally tend, or so many people tend to have an aversion towards meetings, a negative view of meetings. But I think what all of our episodes collectively have highlighted for us is that when we step back and look at them, they are actually so crucially important to what meetings become, or sorry, to what organizations become. And meetings are such an important vehicle to addressing that question. So I suppose if we were to summarize, Paul, you'd say, if anybody is interested in planning, executing, or projecting where their organization is going to go or what it's going to become, a really good place to start would be, well, start by looking at your meetings. Start by critically analyzing how you do your meetings. And if you get hold of how you do your meetings, you have a much, much better chance of strongly influencing what your organization will become and how it will become the organization you want it to be.
Absolutely, absolutely, Martin. And that will be a very interesting conclusion for this year to capture here in this conversation. But perhaps before we go, as we have to do it necessarily brief this time, our viewers are going to be able to watch after our conversation here 48 minutes of summaries from episode 10 to episode 2, 2023. What piece of advice would you give to our viewers, Martin? And just the other day we watched this, and so thankful for anyone registering in our conversations. Line managers, they can be not just consultants, of course, and facilitators. But what piece of advice could you give to anyone concerned with meetings?
I think I would be just reflecting actually the professional advice of so many of our participants, and it's really simple. Before you think about having a meeting, be very clear on stating the purpose. That's the first thing. So why are we meeting and what's our purpose? The second thing is be very clear on defining what outcome do I want to have achieved by the end of the meeting. And once we have those two pieces in place, we are then in the perfect position to design the meeting, to achieve the purpose, and to deliver the outcome. And we are then in the perfect position to manage the meeting in the most appropriate way by selecting the facilitator to assist us, by selecting the chairperson to conduct the meeting, by selecting the appropriate methods or methodologies to engage, interact, and deal with the meeting. And it deals with this before, during, and after. What are we going to do with the outputs? How will we make best use of them? And so on. So if I was offering advice, Paul, that would be it. Prepare well, be clear what the outcomes are, and execute according to the purpose that we set and the outcome that we desire.
Absolutely, Martin. And this was really it captures really the wisdom of this 1 year of episodes 2023. And looking for the future, is there any particular themes you see we could explore in 2024?
There is actually, yeah. I think there's two themes that I will be intrigued to jump into in a little bit more detail, and it's about the impact that meetings can and will have on two elements. One is the organization itself. So how meetings impact the organization's development and what impact they may have. That's the first thematic area that I think will be very much worth exploring. The second is to look at how meetings impact the groups or the teams, that's TEAMS, the teams that operate within organizations. Because one thing that I'm always fascinated by is the cultural subdivisions within organizations. So for example, a sales team or a sales group versus a production group versus a design group. These different types of groups are made up of different types of personalities, and the ways in which they engage and they interact and they meet may need to be fundamentally different to accommodate very different types of personalities. And that's a thematic area that I think will be really interesting to explore, to understand how the types of meetings that we hold might be tailored to most accommodate the types of people that we have getting together within organizational subgroups, departments, project teams, and so on. So they will be my two areas that I think we could usefully focus on in 2024.
Oh, I totally concur with your suggestions, Martin. And dear viewers, if you are watching us and you have other ideas for what you would like to see us talking about 2024, please use our comments here on the event you are just watching, or contact us. We have a new website for 2024. It's mymeetingdoctors.com. So please reach out to us, and we are really eager to assist you in any way we can concerning your meetings and also suggestions for our episodes.
We're actually pushing the edge of the envelope, as we say in the aviation business. It's probably an opportune time, Paul, as you interject, for me to try to do a very quick summary of some of the key points that we discussed. We started our discussion in a slightly unusual place, talking about music, which we hadn't planned, but actually, in the context of meetings, one point that came out, Julie, you shared your experience of having used music in a meeting setting, and the purpose, as you described it, was to build shared connection, shared links, which we'll come to a little bit later. But that idea of building a common baseline that then enables people to bring their diversity and their different opinions to a common base point or to a common starting point. We expanded that idea into ensuring that the meeting that we're attending has shared purpose, so that we have a common understanding of why are we actually here. When we started talking about that, Paul, you introduced the idea of, but what about people who are told to go to the meeting? And we often encounter that. But Martin, you brought in the concept of, well, while music could be used, we talked about that previously, we also then started to discuss the idea of people sharing a little bit of themselves, so that we build a common understanding of where the different participants in the meeting are coming from. So rather than just accepting that somebody is forced to come along to a meeting, if the meeting is handled sensitively, let's say, and empathically, we have a much better chance of drawing out of the participants from the outset. Why are they here? What is it that they hope to take away? What is it that they may be able to contribute? By establishing this baseline, we then build a really strong platform on which diversity of perspectives and backgrounds can now be levered to be brought into the conversation. It was at that point in our conversation, Julie, where you introduced two really interesting concepts. So the individual forces that are present, and that's, Martin, you characterize that as there's a kind of a feel or there's a vibe that you get from the group. So managing those individual forces in combination with, Julie, what you talked about as the invisible links. So drawing out of the group, what are the common points of connection? Both of those perhaps become part of what is the underlying culture that the organization has set for its meetings to take place. Martin, you then made a point about understanding the status of the team or group that we're working with is obviously critically important. So if the group knows each other and meets frequently, that might need to be handled quite differently to if it's a completely new group, depending on what our purpose is, may end up requiring different tools and techniques. But I think all of us agreed that having the shared common purpose, having an empathic feel for interacting with the people. So now we talked about there are humans, not machines. And if I could wrap it all up, Martin, going back to a key point I think that you made, which is we want to try and work with people where they currently are, rather than working with people where we think they should be or where we want them to be. So by working and focusing on that aspect, work with where they are rather than where we are trying to get them, we have a much better chance of being able to foster and get the maximum benefit from diverse perspectives and opinions that are going to be present probably in every workshop or meeting that we actually attend. I'll leave it at that, Paul.
Notes, but I've been trying to mentally track, I guess, the conversation that we've had so far. We started like our theme of measuring productivity versus performance, and I suppose that's where we separated out the idea of performance versus productivity. And I think it's fair to say that we came to the rough conclusion that productivity is relatively easy because it's quantitative, but performance, while performance can be reflected in the quantitative, it doesn't necessarily tell us the whole story. And because it's not telling us the whole story, that then brought us into the conversation of monitoring or managing performance versus productivity of the collective versus the contribution of individuals to that collective. And I think that was partly, Michael, where you brought in the hypo, which I love that particular idea as well. That partly reflected into the anecdote I provided myself of the person who contributes least may, in some instances, actually contribute most when measured from a slightly different perspective. So I guess that then brought us into our conversation about the time frame over which we choose to measure things. So if we're measuring against very short term, and Michael, you gave us the wonderful example of a 3-week piece of work that quantitatively can get measured against a report, a box ticked, but actually under the surface, we might discover not such a well-functioning team, probably not a team that's going to come back together again, probably an investment of time and resource that actually may not have produced nearly as much long-term productivity as we might have reasonably expected. So that concept of if we measure something over a very short time versus over a very long period, how we go about measuring that, we need to be careful about so that we actually measure, I suppose, the most indicative elements that are going to differentiate between the individual's performance versus the collective team performance. I think it's probably fair to say, in summary of our discussion, it's not as simple as just count the number of widgets that were produced at the end of the production line. When we come to the human person-people dynamic, and I think this is a key point, Sue, that you brought out, was we are absolutely people before we are machines. And in being people, measuring what we do, how we do it, and then more importantly, and Sue, I'm now leaning back into something you said, how we do it in conjunction with other people now becomes a really important challenge, so that we then focus on measuring the correct things in the most appropriate way. And it may not always be about quantitative. In fact, it probably won't be always only about quantitative. And we just need to be cautious that we don't measure the wrong thing and end up getting a potentially wrong result.
Mindful of our time, guys, we're approaching 50 minutes, believe it or not, and time has really flown on this one. I normally try to do a very quick summary, but what a rich conversation. It started with a question: how do we build a positive organization meeting positive organization culture? But actually what kicked us off was Gustavo wandering around in the outback, not sure where he was, and wondering about how the mountain lions might come and have him for breakfast. But in actual fact, that was really provocative thought, because that brought us into managing the unknown, dealing with the possibilities of the unknown. But then before you can do that well, you need to become comfortable with the unknown. And the idea then of culture constraining organization meetings because of our rigidity with the format, with the method, with the process, and the possibility then that we might just be losing sight of, but why are we meeting? Is the form of meeting that we're actually proposing to use best fit to meet the outcomes that we're actually trying to achieve? Extending that, we talked more then about the idea of organizations shifting towards more ad hoc type meetings. Elise, you touched on this point for us, and that can be a symptom, a clear enough symptom, that actually the current structured way that we have of managing and running our organizational meetings just may not be fit for purpose. So people spontaneously move to an ad hoc form in order to meet their real needs. And their real needs then might help to focus them in more productive use of their time, rather than sticking with staid or stale meeting procedures that just don't meet expectations or needs. Elise, you also then took us into the idea of the 3 levels in the organization. So the executive C-suite, the teams-based level, but then the concept of iterations. And Gustavo, you picked up on the importance and significance of that iteration piece, which then becomes a key driver of managing the organization's cultural shifts through its organizational meetings. I mentioned then the possibility that meetings can be seen as windows to the soul, to the cultural soul of the organization. Both of you agreed with that concept or that proposition. And I suppose where that took us in our conversation was then to say, actually, maybe when we're convening our meetings, and maybe to become meeting positive, maybe we need to shift the focus of the questions that we're trying to address or trying to answer within any particular or given meeting, either a meeting individually or a flow of meetings that might happen within a team or a group or an organization. So shifting our focus to what question are we trying to answer might be a really significant point to building a meeting positive culture. Because by addressing that question, we have a significant chance of actually carrying out meetings in a way that meet
people's needs. And Gustavo, you focused in our latter part of our conversation on focus on the outcomes, focus on what are we trying to achieve, and then matching how we go about conducting our business to actually deliver that outcome that we're actually looking for. A final point that I think both of you made in slightly different ways is that managing conflict and consent is actually a fundamental and a core part of what an organization needs to do and what meetings are used as a vehicle to do. But most importantly, a key takeaway that I'm getting from it is respect for the individuals can be fundamentally different to having differences of ideas or differences of opinion. And we can absolutely figure out how to manage our differences without ever compromising the fundamental respect that we show for every individual that's participating. I hope that summary has done some justice to a really, really interesting conversation. But we very quickly moved on to the idea that we need to change the language. It's not about meeting because it conjures up too much preconceived ideas. So that you then took us, Ilke, again, you took us into the idea of transcripts and exploration of transcripts and the use of AI to analyze transcripts, summarize transcripts, and then create dynamic links back into the transcript if the summaries don't fully make sense to us. And that's all really valuable material. But this need to shift our thinking on the concept of meeting, and that conjured up the idea of a before, a during, and an after. Central to all of that is this idea that as human beings, we want to get together. But sometimes a big challenge that we have is trying to decipher all of the inputs that are taking place during our get-togethers. So where AI may become a real partner is in the preparation piece, as Ilke identified early on, where it could help us prepare agendas. In the meeting piece, where it can help us to dynamically either create visuals. Karen, you made that point, and there's a real visual out of that, the idea of mind maps and dynamically representing the conversation as it's happening. And then there's the idea of doing summaries after the event with links back into the transcripts to bring us into the full flow if that was necessary. Ilke, can I link that back to the visual that you gave us of conversation, the organization conversation being a river? I called it a river of discourse in my own meeting research, and that islands or meetings are islands within that conversation flow or that river of discourse within organizations. All of that was leading us to say, so what is the precise role that AI can fulfill in the context of getting together for whatever purpose? But that equally brought us into the area of, and I'll pick a number of words that we used. We talked about exploration, creativity, analysis, imagination, emotion. And I won't say we concluded, but I think we explored the idea that, well, AI isn't emotional. It doesn't have emotion. It gives us bland summary, but it doesn't infuse our engagements with passion, with commitment, with diversity, imagination, and stuff. So perhaps our biggest challenge with using AI in pursuit of supporting our get-togethers is to first define what it's meant to do to augment our natural and inherent human need, which is to get together and be emotional, be explorative, be inquisitive, all of the things that AI doesn't seem to be particularly good at. And we just need to figure out before we go too far forward with AI to say, what is it good at, and keep it doing what it's good at, and don't let it try and replace the bit that people are not only good at, we are the only ones capable of being emotional, sensitive, explorative, and so on.
and maybe out of this conversation, we might not have redefined what our meetings should be, but maybe we've just put a mark in the ground to say, well, let's not engage AI too much more until we very clearly decide what is the boundary for it? How can it add value rather than being in awe of what it can do that we can't do? But let's not forget what we can do that it can't do.
That's amazing.
I do, except for that I don't know if we should. I think the way you framed it was first figure it out and then start using. I actually think on that. No, a lot of the things that we were talking about, I don't know what it's going to be like in years, what a meeting will be. Suggesting, and I really liked your point about mindset. I think it's the mindset that you bring to it and the intentionality. I think it's if you without knowing how it's going to help as you're doing that.
Because I think at the end of the conversation, it's certainly in my mind, it's left me with a massive amount more things that you would now want to explore, delve into, consider than certainly what I had in my mind when we started the conversation. Ilke, you started with the concept of real-time analysis by AI, and that analysis could be done thematically, through summaries, through filtering, through identifying concerns, and so on. We talked then about the possibility of AI being able to support the engagement of significantly bigger numbers, 50, 80, 100, 150 people, where it can keep track of considerably more data than the normal human participant or facilitator. I suppose what that leads to, and Jim, I think you picked this one up, was the idea that maybe our whole concept of what it means to meet needs to shift. But that would have to be qualified by a point that Karen and Ilka made, which is that while we may not like meetings as humans, we absolutely not only like to meet, I think, but we need to meet. That's part of the human condition. Jim, you raised the point that if we don't meet, how do we have community? How do we have organizations? How do we have groups? How do we have teams? So the picture emerging from our conversation is that AI has this possibility to act as a fly on the wall. I think I introduced the phrase fly on the wall. It has that possibility not to take over the meeting, but actually to add to the meeting something that we humans actually can't add to the meeting. We can't step back from the totality of the conversation that's taking place. We can't analyze that totality in real time. AI can do that. And then it can feed back into the conversation. And Ilke, your point just towards the end of our discussion was maybe it can feed back in with a judicious question, with a thought-provoking question, with a summarizing question that can help to bring focus back, not to where AI decides the focus should be, but where AI has analyzed our content and said, here's the breakdown, here's the weighting, here's the emotion, and when we put it together algorithmically, here's the conclusion that you guys are reaching, not that AI is reaching. But that then brings us to, I suppose, I raised the point about security and the concept of if we're all being recorded, if that recording is being retained, and the purpose or role to which that recording is put in the short future or even in the long future, do we end up needing to protect and preserve that through some form of legislative framework? Jim, you raised the point that, well, perhaps organization norms, culture, standing operating procedures, guidelines, perhaps they can help us here. But it also begs the question that if people use AI output nefariously, then does it expose people to the point where they stop contributing themselves or of themselves out of concern that they may be misrepresented at a later date because that recording is there. And Ilke, you made the point that transcripts of the recordings are even more risky because they're now searchable. And so there's a big question there that we've touched on, but we haven't explored or we haven't bottomed it out. The overall conclusion that I'm drawing from our conversation so far is actually AI won't make meetings obsolete because we're humans, we're going to continue meeting. However, AI has a very strong possibility of completely transforming what we mean by meetings. And we all might just need to go back to the drawing board to say, well, what do we want meetings to be in light of the fact that we have this ear fly on the wall who can do so much more that we can't? And then we can ask ourselves, okay, how might we change our meetings in order to make maximum use of this all listening fly on the wall?
Martin, I think we are reaching out our time. Our viewers will be eager to stay with us for another hour or so, but I'm sure we have plenty of stuff to do after this cup of coffee, watching us on LinkedIn or on our social media channels where we are showing this interesting conversation so far. So what have we learned about the art of hosting face-to-face meetings so far? And the wrap up on the program today.
What a whirlwind. Where would I start? We need to get AI to do the analysis, Paul.
There you go. That too.
let me have a crack at it. We started by suggesting, Kirsty, you pitched in first saying maybe we're out of practice with the face-to-face meetings. What we discovered was that the virtual meetings that we attended, particularly during the pandemic, probably gave all of us a degree of respite that allowed us to switch off cameras, switch off microphones, take a pause, step back, scream at the camera without anybody knowing that we were screaming. And we had to rehabituate ourselves back into face-to-face. But then we very quickly changed tack. We said, do we actually have face-to-face expertise in meetings? And that brought us onto a completely different track and a really interesting track. So a couple of things that came out of that. We basically talked about meeting leadership, meeting management, and we used our own personal anecdotes and so on to explore the idea that just because you're the leader doesn't mean you have to be the chair. If you are going to be the chair, are we presupposing a particular type of meeting? And does that cover all possible types of meetings? And I think we pretty much agreed, well, actually, it does presuppose and we have to chair every meeting, but we have to manage our meetings. So that brought us into the whole area of preparation for meetings, pre-planning for meetings, the importance of setting the outcome before we ever get into the beginning of the meeting. So we explored that a little bit. Kirsty, you took us into the purpose, the outcome, the structure, and the time, POST, as a simple but really illuminating acronym for if you answer those 4 key questions in preparation, there's a very, very good chance that you're going to have the right people, the right time, and you're going to have the right. We then talked a little bit about post-action reviews. We drifted into the military a little bit. We talked about aviation, which I brought in because that's my own personal professional background. We talked about evaluation apprehension as a possible reason why many organizations don't seem to reflect on their meetings. And we very briefly explored why that might be. And I suggested an idea that Edward de Bono actually came up with, which is the use of plus minus interesting as a really simple tool, a bit like POST in preparing for meetings. Well, maybe we can have a PMI at the meeting to evaluate in a safe way
but in a slightly self-critical way. Critical positive, critical negative, but equally critical, did anything interesting come up? We then segued, we did a major left turn, I think was the way you called it, Joe. And we started to talk about AI. And I'm certain we could be here for another 3 or 4 hours talking in the direction that we had started to go. But I leave it at that. I hope that's a reasonably faithful and quick summary of some of the key points that we managed about in a really interesting discussion.
Absolutely, Martin. Thank you so much for summarizing this. We'll compare now with our AI note taker and we'll judge. Everybody in this meeting will be able to judge that. So final word, golden nugget. Kirsty, Joe, what do you have to share with our viewers here on LinkedIn? Perhaps they will be looking for you guys as meeting doctors to help them on their meetings. Can I have a golden nugget from both of you to close these today?
I think Joe's taught me something about me, which is evaluation apprehension. So thank you, Joe. That was, you've named something for me. And I was like, oh yeah, I recognize that.
Yeah. And Kirsty, thank you for POST, because that was a great acronym that speaks it's very similar to the two questions I always tell people to ask themselves when they're about to schedule a meeting. One, does the meeting have a purpose? If you say yes, ask the second question, which is, does that meeting require collaboration? Or does that purpose require collaboration? If you say yes to both of those, proceed to schedule your meeting. If you say no to either one, stop it.
Yeah.
You probably don't need a meeting.
Love it.
Okay, guys, so this is about it. That I hope that you enjoyed the program with us today, and please stay with us, as next month we're going to expand on this conversation and bringing AI into the field. That's all for now, and thank you so much for watching. It was great to have you here. Martin, perhaps you'd like to summarize a little bit, and we wrap up with the last.
Yeah, just I suppose the first thing that struck me, you kind of opened, Charles, by taking us into the context and the connections that people have. You identified 3 different elements. One is the physical capacity or physical proximity. 2 is creating the time, and then 3 was creating a free environment, or an environment in which free exchange can happen unimpeded. We then talked a little bit about identifying the gaps between people, particularly then you talked about the isolation of the leader and the sense that some leaders have this developing sense of isolation from their teams, from their groups. And when I asked about why was that isolation developing, you identified again 3 key elements, one of which was social media, but the other was the idea of people physically moving jobs, moving locations, moving home, but equally moving groups. And you spoke a little bit about faith and moving their faith groups. Now, irrespective of what religious beliefs you might have, the key point is that when people are moving from a known community, whatever the community is, now we end up with the possibilities of greater and greater isolation. But I suppose the key thing that I'm taking out of our conversation is that the interpersonal connections coming from shared experiences, from shared emotional grounding, from shared intellectual exposure,
that those elements create the foundation on which trust ultimately can get built. And I suppose the final analogy, which I really love, is that it doesn't take much water to get growth in a desert. And as a really simple summary of, are we in a hopeful or a hopeless environment? I would share your optimism and say, actually, a teacup of water will do an awful lot to build an awful lot of growth in a desert.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much, Martin. And over to you, Charles. Last piece of advice for our viewers and wherever they are.
I'm happy to give advice, but I want to make sure that your listeners know that I've written several books on the subject. And so if their interest is piqued whatsoever, there is more. They're the books that are being used around the world and some of the world's most famous brands to make their teams more effective and to connect people in ways that are supportive in a crisis time. My first book is The Art of Community. And then I wrote a book called Storytelling for Leadership, because in all leadership, bring people together is their powerful stories that make that happen. And then lastly, my latest book on the subject is Building Brand Communities. In this case, any organization, for-profit, nonprofit, political, that has a brand, how to bring people together that are important for success. And then last piece of advice, let's go start at the beginning. All community starts at the same place, an invitation. And my work is a request to spend time where someone knows that someone cares if they show up. And I'm convinced that if everybody listening right now invites 5 people they already want to spend more time with, just makes the request to spend that time, walking around a park, eating a bowl of noodles, playing with dogs, all count. That's the beginning of relationships that can grow much deeper.
Hey, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for watching us today. Charles Vogel, our guest speaker today, was an amazing masterclass. Thank you so much, Martin, as usual, for the wonderful summary of the conversation. And for our viewers, you want to know more about Charles Vogel, just follow him on this event page. He's our guest speaker for today. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for watching. It was really great to be here with all of you. Bye for now.
Thanks very much. Bye all. Yeah, I'll have to keep this one very short, Paul. Thank you both for some really interesting and provocative ideas. I suppose key point that we started with was culture operates nationally, organizationally, and even there are multiple subcultures. Well-being, tricky to define, difficult to track, very personal. It's personal to individuals. It's then personal to organizations. So challenging to make a correlation. So that would be my overall sense. Couple of things that I think came out of it. The whole question of the impact of national culture on organizational cultures, the timeline over which they might happen, where the shifts might be changing, have to be taken into account. We have all had an aberration, which was the pandemic, that took 2 years to more or less see us through it, making it even more challenging to make an assessment or a firm grounding of the impact of our culture on well-being. But I'd summarize it in the very last point, Anthony, that you made, which I think is one. It's an optimistic point, but it's the whole question of the impact of social media on our organizations. My analogy of the garden hose from 15 or 20 years ago to the multiple fire hoses of today, which is largely due to social media, but perhaps we are at the very bottom of that well-being curve with the possibility to increase positively on well-being. But it's likely to need a shift, which you identified, Anthony, of does social media itself now need to change because of AI, because of the lack of clarity as to whose voice are we hearing? Is that likely to drive people back into individual personal connections? And from that, we would hope that personal well-being and collective well-being would start to actually have an upward trajectory into the coming years. This is one of these discussion topics that we could fill a day if we had a day. We've run out of time. I think it feels like it's probably been one of the quickest conversations we've had in our fireside chats. I normally try to do a kind of a 1 minute or a minute and a half very quick summary to catch some of the key points. So I might try that if I may. We started just discussing the idea of happiness versus wellness. And I think we broadly concluded they're two sides of the same coin. They go hand in glove. But that brought us into asking about the idea of happiness comes from relative thinking. So if you have a point of comparison, then your assessment of your own happiness may fundamentally change and fundamentally alter. I suppose that makes it a requirement then to look as much inward as outward, because if you only exclusively look outward for comparison, you may miss a whole lot of internal reasons to be or to feel happy. And Isabella, I think you made that particular point, but you also made the point at the same time that it's an evolutionary thing. It's a life cycle thing, that we don't necessarily come to that conclusion until we've been around a couple of blocks of happiness and perhaps unhappiness before we discover that we need to look equally inside as outside to arrive at our own sense of that wellness. That brought us into a discussion about culture, which brought us to a national level discussion. And then we moved into an organization focused culture. Paolo, you made two really interesting points about how we measure this. And you referred to the USA Organization of Psychology from 2000 that started looking at the individual measurement. And then 2010, the HBR articles that now started to look at the organizational value, economic value that can be put on wellness or well-being. That's brought us into the area of, so at national level, how might we go about measuring it? And Obi, you made reference to Bhutan's, where they have a number of key metrics. They've got 4 pillars, they've got 9 themes on which they actually try to make that measurement. I do know just from personal background reading and stuff, New Zealand has something similar. I'm just not familiar with the detail of that. That, I suppose, then brings us into, so at a national level of well-being, what can governments actually do? And Paul, you posed the question provocatively to us and absolutely bang on to say the unhappiness drivers. What might those unhappiness drivers be? And how do we avoid them? How do we stay away from them? 2 points arose there, is this sense of security. And the second thing was closeness to nature. And the final word, Paolo, I'm leaving it to your good self, in the concept of sharing gratitude. If we were to identify one thing that actually promotes happiness stroke well-being in both the giver and the receiver, it's expression, direct, overt expression and sincere expression of gratitude. And maybe that's something when we step back and look at our current society ills, maybe if we expressed a bit more gratitude and maybe a bit less expectation or belief in entitlement, maybe the wellness quotient or the happiness quotient might increase substantially. I'll leave it at that, Paul, if you wanted to round us.
There's a final tradition that we have in hosting our fireside chats, and I normally try to do literally a 1 minute or a 1.5 minute review or summary of some of the key points that we've discussed. So if I may, I suppose we started our conversation really talking about how much engagement the coach has, and I perhaps mistakenly framed it in terms of speaking. And I think the three of you concurred that if a coach is speaking more than about 10%, it might be a little bit too much. But actually, Stefania, you said that in some instances, a little bit more initially might be necessary in order to build and establish that foundation and that relationship. But I think all of you also concurred that a key part of the coach's job is to be present. And Steve, I think you made the point that being present doesn't require you to speak, that actually being present is optimally achieved when you're not saying anything. So it's building that empathetic relationship through listening seems to be a key competence of the coach and of the coaching relationship. The 10% of time that you would end up speaking seems to be more focused on asking key questions to get to the bottom of what the coaching relationship is intended to be about. And Stefania, I think you made the point tellingly later in our conversation that being clear on what the purpose of the coaching relationship is of paramount importance, because having that clarity then helps to maximally inform the nature and the content of the questions that are going to be asked. So again, coaching is not something that has this preordained long list of typical questions. It's more about the skill and the aptitude of the coach to be able to build that empathy through listening with their coachee. Steve, I think you introduced us to your personal core belief around our purpose in life and the idea of growth and the idea of love, and that both of those can be fused together through the coach's, I suppose, use of the coaching relationship to show that form of love. It's a platonic love, but it's a love for the underlying individual. And then through that, to enable the growth, which is one of the overriding purposes. That kind of brought us into the international dimension, where I put the question to you that from your experience, do national cultures have an impact on the coaching relationship? And probably the single biggest takeaway for me is that the three of you seem to concur that actually, when you strip away all of the national boundaries, national cultures, national histories, we are all people first and foremost. And at our core, it doesn't matter where we've come from. It actually matters that we are people, and that connection through the coaching relationship actually establishes fairly quickly and can transcend national backgrounds and national histories fairly rapidly. So I hope that has done some justice to a really interesting and in-depth exploration of coaching. Fad, fiction, or the future? My vote says, actually, I think it has a pretty good future, certainly in your three very capable hands.